Loving God, from the beginning of time, you have longed for us to live in relationship with you and all things created. Bless our speakers so that his words may call us ever deeper into your vision and closer understanding to the living of your reign. May his words be strong and true and courageous and faithful to your commands. May he feel the presence of your Spirit this evening and all the days of his life. We make this prayer as we make all of our prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Well, that was certainly very nice. Thank you. I do a fair amount of speaking, and that's one of the few times that anyone has ever prayed over me or for me and before I began. So again, thank you all. Hopefully those prayers will help me not to get in the way of the message tonight. I know Bill already welcomed you here, but let me thank you for your presence here tonight on a drizzly evening. I'm sure if things went a little different last week at Wrigley Field, I would probably be the only one here tonight. So, we are going to be talking tonight about change and looking at a faith-filled embrace of change. How does our faith speak to our change and really make any significant impact, make any difference when we move through particularly the more difficult changes in our lives? So really what I'm going to be talking about is transitions and the Paschal Mystery. And if you're not quite sure what the Paschal Mystery is, that's absolutely fine. You'll know all about it by the time you leave this evening. My guess is, just looking around the room, that we are all probably in some mode of change in our life. Perhaps kids are getting older and they're getting launched into the world, maybe high school or college bound. Perhaps we're thinking about retirement. Perhaps our own parents are getting older. Perhaps we're going through a work-life transition. Maybe there's some financial insecurity in our life that's creating some change. Perhaps we've got health issues that we're dealing with that are triggering change as well. Whether you look at your life from the perspective of work, whether you look at it from the perspective of your relationships, the perspective of your own health, chances are the best way to describe life is omni-changing. Things always seem to be in some type of flux, some type of change. And what I want to suggest to you is that most of us, for the most part, enjoy change, particularly a change in the weather, which hopefully we'll have tomorrow. Perhaps a change in the vacation spot that we normally go to, a change in the car we drive. Those kinds of changes are typically welcome in our lives. Transitions, though, they're a different story. All transitions involve change, but not every change is a transition. Right? And that'll become clearer as the night goes on. Every change that we go through doesn't have the kind of impact that transitions do. And the reason for that is when we're in a transition, there's a breakdown of the way we think about ourselves. There's a breakdown about the way we think about our world. Everything is sort of thrown upside down, and that is precipitated by change. Transitions often create some type of a crisis in our lives. Rahm Emanuel, who's now the mayor of Chicago, but back when he was the chief of staff for Obama, if you remember, he was famous for saying, never let a crisis go to waste. And this is what the interesting thing about crisis is. The Chinese, when they write the character for crisis, they use two different characters. On the top, they write the character for pain, and on the bottom, they write the character for opportunity. So that's what we're going to explore tonight as we think about transition and change. We're going to be talking about the pain of it, because, let's face it, when we're in transition, it can be awfully painful. But we're also going to talk about the opportunity that comes along with it, the possibility, the creativity that also accompanies change. And here's our game plan for tonight. I am going to, maybe for about 25 minutes or so, give you a framework to understand transition in your life more from a psychological level, from a psychological point of view. What's happening to us when we're moving through a transition? And then I'm going to ask you for a little quiet time and a little personal reflection, mapping out some of the transitions that you've been through. We'll have some conversation at tables. During that time, you're free to take a little break. Then when we come back, what we're going to do is put a faith perspective over the framework that we built early on, and look at how this Paschal Mystery, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, really is archetypal, if you will. It didn't just happen to Jesus, it happens to you and me throughout our life. So we'll look at how the Paschal Mystery really can help us move through change in a faith-filled way. That's our plan. But you all should have a packet. If you don't have a packet of handouts that really just mirror my slides that I'm going to show you, maybe you can let us know. And let's get started. The first slide on your handout is a diagram that sort of maps out the two types of transitions. Transitions come in sort of two varieties, if you will. There are developmental transitions. Those are transitions that we can expect, right? They're anticipated. You might think of them as chapters in your life. About 3 years ago now, I turned 50. Now, I've read somewhere that every day 10,000 people in this country turn 50, but it was the first time I ever turned 50. And that's the thing about these developmental transitions. Even though they're common for all of us, when we get there, it's the first time we're experiencing it. And when I turned 50, it was not a particularly joyful experience. It was one of the harder birthdays that I have had. And this is what happens as we move through developmental transitions. Although they're expected, although we can even count on them happening, you never know just how they might turn your world upside down. So some examples of developmental transitions that we've all been through, most likely, is we've all left our family of origin and struck it out on our own. We all entered the workforce at some level. Many of us got married or had a significant relationship. Many of us had children, perhaps. Retirement is a developmental transition. Our own parents passing away is a developmental transition. We can expect that usually to happen in the course of our lives. And those triggers, those changes, all create these types of transitions. Now, the other category of transition, if you will, is situational. And these are transitions that are not expected. They're not predictable. They often come at the very worst time. And oftentimes, we might be in the throes of a developmental transition, and a situational transition sneaks up on us. So, in other words, a situational transition might be, I lost my job, right? I lost a loved one. I have a health crisis. It doesn't always have to be a negative trigger. It could be something very positive. I may have gotten a promotion at my job, right? I may have found my true love, right? I may have won the lottery, which doesn't happen to too many of us, but it can create a situational transition in our lives. And so this category of transition, if you will, again, unexpected, unpredictable, we never know what it's going to happen, and it sort of creates the uniqueness of our own journey, because no two people go through the same types of transitions from birth to death. So this sort of gives you a framework of thinking about types of transitions. If you turn your page, you will see another diagram. And as I mentioned, most of us welcome change, but it's transitions that we have a problem with. And the reason for that is that transitions involve a loss of our identity, a breakdown of our world. So you see on the left, we move from a stable life definition or life situation, and then a transition begins when something ends. So transitions begin with an ending. Right? And how much we were attached to what ended creates the profundity of our loss. For example, one of my good friends who's been working for the same bank since we got out of graduate school, 27 years, about 6 months ago, lost his job. Now, for 27 years, he knew where he needed to be every Monday morning. He had 27 years of colleagues and customers that became really friends. He has a family with 3 kids, and that family depends on the salary that he makes from that bank. He's had an opportunity to rise in that bank, developing his skills, and really making a nice life for himself. Now, that has all come to an end. Right? I have a neighbor who's 6-year-old, was just diagnosed with diabetes. So again, an ending. The child's health no longer is what it once was. There's a loss that accompanies that ending, and the magnitude of that loss creates the grief that we move through. So this is why, things like losing a loved one, going through a divorce, losing your job are all sort of the biggest triggers that we can experience that move us into times of transition in our lives. So transitions, they begin with an ending. But if you look, they end with a new beginning. Right? Something new emerges in our life. The trouble is, we're never quite sure when it's going to get here. We're never quite sure what it's going to be like. We're never quite sure if we're going to be happy in it, if we're going to be successful at it, if it's going to be as good as it used to be. My wife and I are about to launch our last child into college. And so for 22 years, we've had kids in the house. Now we're about to move to another time in our relationship where it's just me and her, right? And the thought enters my mind, will we ever be as happy, just me and her, as we were when all the kids were around us, right? That is an ending that creates a loss, that triggers grief, that will come to an end when we have a new beginning, when my wife and I somehow reestablish our relationship, although I have no idea what that's going to look like right now, right? And if you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. So transitions begin with an ending, they end with a new beginning. The most difficult part of the transition, though, is getting from the ending to the beginning. Bill Bridges calls that the neutral zone. Murray Stein calls it liminality. That's your $5 word for the evening. Liminality, liminal space. Liminal means threshold. So when we are in this time of a transition, we are virtually in a threshold, right? We have left one room and we're not quite yet in the other room. We're betwixt and between, if you will. The feeling when we're in that liminal space is often disillusionment, right? I feel like everything that I thought was real has somehow evaporated. Life kind of loses its gravitas. Anxiety is more common when we are in this time of transition. We're just a little bit more fearful about everything. We feel disconnected. We feel more vulnerable. Oftentimes, we say things like, geez, I just don't know who I am anymore. Right? Or the one I love is, I'm beside myself. It's a great image. I'm beside myself. I used to be this guy over here, but now I feel like I'm standing beside myself because I'm not quite sure who I am. Depression is common. Not clinical depression, but just a terrible loss of energy. I call it the Afghan syndrome, where some days you just want to be on your couch, put the Afghan around you, and watch daytime TV. For me, it's like SportsCenter over and over and over again. That's what it's like to be in liminal space. About 12, 13 years ago, I went through a whopper of a transition myself. I left my job because I had great aspirations of doing something different, and those were not coming to any cohesion in any real way. So I was floundering at work. And then my dad died. And then I had an accident where I fell out of my attic and I had to have back surgery. And then 2 weeks after my back surgery, I got the chicken pox. And at 40 years old, when you get the chicken pox, it's not pleasant. So I had a work trigger, I had a relationships trigger, I lost my dad, and I had a health trigger. And for a good 9 months, I just existed in liminal space, right? I tried to keep up appearances, but and kind of go through the motions like we do when we're in that space in our lives, but really all I was good for was playing catch with my 7-year-old and taking long walks around the neighborhood. Liminal space, when we're in it, can really blister the spirit. It leaves us groping, right? It's painful. It's no fun. We want to get out of it as soon as we can. But here's what I want to suggest to you. When we're in that space, it's not just the voices of pain that we are listening to. The voices of creativity are also present. The voices of possibility are there. The trouble is, we often don't hear those until we're all the way through our transition, right? Until we kind of can look in the rearview mirror and say, oh, that's what was happening. Now I understand how the pieces were coming together. But when I was in it, I was just maybe overwhelmed with pain or confusion. I had no idea what was happening in my life. So these voices of liminal space are not simply voices of pain, they're also voices of creativity. Liminal space, a great image for that is fallow time, right? When you think about fallow time, maybe what comes to mind is farming. And if you know anything about farming, and I really don't know much, but it's a great analogy for what I'm trying to communicate to you. When a farmer leaves the field fallow, right, doesn't plant on it, you and I would look out at that field and say, wow, nothing's happening. There's no crops growing. It's just empty. Right? But the farmer knows better, right? The farmer knows that the soil is breaking down, right? The soil is preparing itself to grow healthy crops once again. And that's what's happening to you and I when we find ourselves in this liminal space. Right? We are getting prepared, if you will, for the next chapter, to grow again. And what I want to suggest to you is that fallow time is necessary. It's important time in the life of our journey. In the Christian tradition, there's a terrific image, and you may not think of it this way, but it's the virgin birth. The virgin birth. Now, whatever that might mean on the physical level, let's put that aside. On the spiritual level, the virgin birth is about an empty vessel that gets impregnated with divine possibility. Right? It's an empty vessel being impregnated with divine possibility. And that is what is happening to us when we're in this liminal space. We're being emptied out. And it's painful. It's very painful. But there's a reason for that. Because only the empty vessel is ready to be impregnated again by the divine. That's what the virgin birth is about on the level of spirit. But this birthing process, if you will, it takes time. You know, just ask any mom that gestation takes time. And if you're a Tom Petty fan, the waiting is the hardest part, as you know. We hate to wait. At least I hate to wait. Because when we're waiting, we're feeling like we're doing nothing. We're not getting anything accomplished. And that's why, you know, sometimes when we find ourselves in line at the grocery store, we will move over to the line that seems like it has less people so we can save 45 seconds, because those 45 seconds are awfully important, because we all hate to wait. But in this time of transition, waiting is necessary. The Buddha says, don't just do something, stand there. Right? Don't just do something, stand there. Because when we're waiting, we may be doing the most important thing we possibly can at that time in our life, which is letting our souls grow up, letting them mature in ways that they wouldn't mature if not for this experience of liminality. You know, we can easily look to the natural world to think about what is happening here, and it's so apparent when you look at the natural world, because right now we're in fall, right? And it's the time of dying. It's the time of letting go. It's the time of endings, right? Leaves are coming to the ground. Weather's getting colder. Soon we're going to be in winter, when things are dark and cold and lifeless. That is a great example of liminal space. Chicago winter is a great analogy for liminal space and what that's like. But we have to move through winter in order to get to spring again. Right? And then to finally, when everything is in bloom, to summer. But then what happens? Summer passes and we find ourselves back ending again. And this, my friends, is the journey of our lives too, because anything that is organic, and you and I are certainly organic, grows and develops through this same pattern of transition. So let me just back up and recapture some ground that we've been on. So there's really two seductions, if you will, might be a way to talk about it when we find ourselves in transition. The first seduction is to have instant knowing versus deliberate waiting, right? So we want to know immediately when we're going to get to the new beginning and what it's going to be like. We don't want to have to go through any of that liminal space. The other seduction is security versus adventure. Security versus adventure. I'm going to tell you a story from the Gospels, and maybe you could hear this a little differently. It's the story you probably all know. It's when Jesus asked the man to follow him. And the guy says, Jesus, I'm going to be right with you, but first I have to bury my father. Seems reasonable. But Jesus gives him a very harsh answer. He says, leave the dead to bury the dead and come and follow me. Leave the dead to bury the dead. What is he talking about? Well, this is what he's talking about. The initial move that most of us have when we find ourselves in a space of liminality is to put it all back together again the way it used to be. Right? To try to make what used to be once again possible or real. To go back to that. But Jesus recognizes that's futile. Right? Leave the dead to bury the dead. Separate yourself from that and follow me to the new life that I promise you. That is the seduction, right? Security versus adventure. Let me show you a different diagram. So here you've got two axes. The horizontal axis is really time. It goes from past to future. And the vertical axis is you. So you can think of everything under the horizontal axis as your inner self or your internal self. Everything above it as your external self. So transitions begin, again, when something comes to an end. So in the top left quadrant, something ends, right? In the external world, typically. And our first reaction usually is denial. Oh, this can't be happening. How can this be happening? You know, you read stories of people who lose their job and they continue to take the train to Chicago and show up and get dressed just because they just can't admit it. They just have such a hard time admitting what has come to an end. And that's how it is for all of us at some level. When that first ending happens, we want to deny the external reality of our lives, like, no way, this cannot be happening. Then we begin to resist it. And that happens inside. This is what happens when we're in that liminal space, struggling as we do to accept the reality that we find ourselves in. We begin to push back, right? I don't want to do anything, right? I don't want to get up and look for another job. I don't want to get up knowing that I can't be with the one I love anymore. I resist my life. I just don't want to go forward. But finally, something begins to shift internally in us. And check this out in your own transitions that you've been in and through. Something begins to transform, and some of that energy of resistance moves to energy of exploration. We start to, get a little curious, get a little more interested in other people, other things, getting out a little more perhaps. But what usually happens is we're caught swinging at the bottom of that trough. We resist some, we explore some. We resist some, we explore some. And eventually, that exploration leads us to some new external commitment. And our life gets a little bit more settled, a little bit more stable, and we can feel, quote unquote, normal once again. But this is another way to think about what is happening inside of us as we move through a transition. I have a number of friends who work for Arthur Andersen. And they're all, again, gainfully employed after that implosion of Arthur Andersen. And they're all quite successful, too. But they're different. And here's how they're different. I have a group of friends who will talk about that time of Arthur Andersen imploding and what happened to them as a result, as a time that was necessary. It was difficult, yeah, they hated going through it, but it was necessary in order to get them to where they are now. There's another group of friends that I have, again, they're in a different place, they're all working again. Externally, you couldn't tell the difference. But internally, they still talk about Arthur Andersen with bitterness. Right? They still talk about that time with resistance. Right? They still are very resentful about what happened to them back at Andersen. And this is how we know when we've sort of successfully moved through a transition. When we can look back and have that ending that so much felt like a curse when it was happening, see it now here as more of a blessing. We can allow it to bless us. Again, it doesn't take away the pain, but it's not just pain. Right? It's something more than pain that we experienced because of my time at Arthur Andersen when it blew up. Because of the loss that I experienced, because of the ending that happened. It doesn't take away the pain, it doesn't take away the difficulty. We just begin to recognize that there's more there than we once realized. I want to tell you, I got to find my page here to read this to you. I want to tell you, if you're ever in transition, and I, for the last 15 years, I've worked at the Career Transition Center in Chicago, so I work with a lot of people who are in transition, and usually my first thing I suggest is they go watch The Wizard of Oz. Because The Wizard of Oz is perhaps the greatest transition story ever told. And I'm going to give you the brief the brief telling of it here so you can sense what I'm talking about. If you remember in the story, it begins with Dorothy, and she's in Kansas, and she's in that small kind of gray house, and life has become very narrow for her. Her roles and expectations are just so small and tight, and she's just aching for something more. Right? And you find her over the rainbow, or at the gate, thinking about what could possibly be over the rainbow, because her life has become so small. And then what happens? Then the cyclone comes, the tornado comes, and it changes everything. It throws everything upside down. And notice what Aunt Em does. Aunt Em runs outside to that cellar door, lifts the lid, crawls in the ground, and says, Dorothy, come in here, you know, we'll protect ourselves, we'll cover ourselves up, we'll let the cyclone pass, and then we'll put our lives back together just the way they were. Now sure, half the chickens will be dead, the cow will be gone, but we'll put our lives back together just the way it was. And again, that's the temptation, to want to go back to the way it used to be. But Dorothy doesn't do that. Dorothy lets the tornado pick her up and carry her to an unimagined place. And this is where I want to read to you from the book, The Wizard of Oz. And this is right after the house gets picked up from by the cyclone. It says, it was very dark, and the wind howled terribly around her. Hour after hour passed away, and slowly Dorothy got over her fright. At first she had wondered if she would be dashed to pieces when the house fell again. But as the hours passed, she stopped worrying and resolved to wait calmly and see what the future would bring. She stopped worrying and resolved to wait calmly to see what the future would bring. And what did it bring? She found herself in this crazy place, and she met some crazy friends. She met a scarecrow without a brain. Read that. During her time of transition, she learned to think for herself. She met a tin woodsman without a heart. During her walk through liminal space, she began to feel her feelings more. She met a lion with no courage. During her time, her walk through transition, she discovers her own inner metal. Those things would never have been hers had she not let the house take her where it was going to take her and drop her in some what felt like a very godforsaken place. What else happened to Dorothy? She had all these questions, right? All these questions. What's the power of these ruby slippers? Right? How will I ever get the broom back from the Wicked Witch of the West? Perhaps the most important question, how will I get home? When we're in transition, we have questions that wake us up at 3 o'clock in the morning. They don't let us go back to sleep again. They're questions we can't answer. They're questions that we just have to live with and live in. And here's what I want to suggest to you, friends. Creativity doesn't exist in certainty. Creativity exists only in ambiguity. When we know everything, there's nothing creative about that. It's when we are forced to live in these questions that we cannot resolve, we cannot easily answer. That is when creativity, that is when growth, that is when possibility happens. So as difficult as it is, it's also necessary. I want to go back to this slide just to make one point. You know, because transitions are dynamic, right? And this kind of leads you to believe that you know, they start here, they end here. Well, you can really fall into a transition anywhere. Transitions really can happen with a new beginning. Oftentimes, if you've ever been in a long-term relationship or if you've ever been married, you realize, okay, you get married, it's a new beginning, everything is beautiful, but oh my God, all of a sudden I figured out what ended, right? You know, my past life, my freedom, the way I used to be, the way I used to relate to the world, and now I'm in this liminal space trying to work things out with my spouse, and everything feels so upside down, and it takes so long sometimes to get adjusted. Same thing can happen with a promotion at work. Again, a new beginning. Terrific. I'm so happy I got a promotion. Until I realized that the friends that I used to have at work, I'm now their supervisor, right? They're not confiding in me the way they used to be, right? I don't have the same kind of relationship with them that I used to have, And now I find myself in this liminal space trying to adjust. So again, it's not necessarily a three-point switch, but as you move through a transition, all these stages are always present as somewhere. We're going to move through them eventually. How we move through them may always be a little different. Which leads me to my last and final diagram for you before I invite you to think about your own transition. And a lot of career coaches use this diagram. It's called the life spiral. It really represents you. And maybe you think, boy, is my life a tornado? Or but really, this is the journey of our life, when you think about it. That the time we come to the planet is right there at the bottom. The time we leave the planet is right at the top. And what it suggests is that our life is not linear. Our life is pretty much cyclical. We have patterns that repeat themselves day, week, month after month, right? But eventually something shifts in those patterns, and life takes a turn. And notice what happens when life takes a turn. The spiral begins to expand a little bit, which hopefully that means in our journey of life, as we move through these transitions, we are growing not only in age, but we are growing in wisdom, we are growing in love. And generally speaking, the first half of our life, the growth occurs by acquiring stuff, right? So I get an education, I get a job, I get maybe my first house, I get a spouse, maybe we have kids, right? It's a lot of acquisition that happens that creates these transitions in the first part of life. In the second part of life, usually what happens is I grow through subtraction. Things are taken away. Or I'm more intentional about where I spend my time and energy. And I don't have as many things that I'm focused on because I realize that all I really need are these things. I've accumulated a lot of baggage by the time I'm 50, and it's time to jettison some of that because it's just way too heavy to carry. My dad, for the last 18 months of his life, was almost bedridden, and he was on a feeding tube. And I am convinced his spiral continued to expand because he would bring us over and he would just talk about going golfing or the vacations that we had together or his time at United Parcel Service. And it was in his revisiting and remembering his life story that his life story began to take on a meaning and a richness that perhaps it didn't have until he had that opportunity when he was forced to be bedridden and have all that time to reflect and think. So this is what can happen in a life well lived, so to speak. We have this beautiful spiral. And that's not always how it goes, as we know, right? Sometimes that spiral goes out at first, but then it gets very narrow. And I'm pretty sure you know people in your life that have a very narrow hair at the top, and they're just not as fun to be around typically if we're honest, right? So transitions and the way that we move through transition really matters. It really matters in terms of our life journey and the people that we eventually become in this life. So let me pause there and ask you to flip the next page. And here's where you have to go to work. There is, what I'm going to ask you to do, and there's a typo in the sheet. Let me, we'll get to it. But I'm going to ask you just to think about some of your own transitions that you've walked through yourself. And you might want to start with the last 10 years and work your way backwards, or you might want to start when you're younger and work your way forwards, or think about the transition that had the greatest impact and start there and go wherever you want. But see if you can, in the next 10 minutes or so, name 4 or 5 transitions that you had. Right? And down here, I'd invite you to name what ended, what was the ending, as best you can describe it. What was the new beginning that you found yourself in? And this is not leanings, this is the typo, this is learnings, right? So what do you think that time of transition had to teach you? About yourself, about others, about the world? Maybe you discovered some inner resilience that you didn't know you had. Maybe you came to your faith in a way that you never had before. Maybe you grew in a relationship with a family member or friends in ways that wouldn't have been possible had it not been for this transition. So again, we're only going to take just 10 minutes to give you a taste of this. But see if you can't come up with a few at least. And we'll take it from there. And then I'll come back in 10 minutes and I'll give you the next direction, if you will. But is everyone clear enough to get started on this? Any questions? All right, friends, thanks. I invite you to share your own stories at the table, a chance to share your own wisdom. What from the comments maybe sparked some ideas or reflection in you? What do you resonate with? What do you struggle with? What maybe needs more clarity? Maybe you want to share a story of a transition in your own life, and what that was like for you, what you discovered, what you learned, how you see it now, looking at it from a perspective of already having gone through it, and what going through past transitions may have to teach you about a current transition that maybe you're already in. My guess is that some of you probably came to the topic because you're in the throes of some type of transition. So if you're at a table with maybe 3 people and you feel that's enough, great. But maybe you want to join forces and come to another table, feel free to do that. But let's take until 25 after, and we'll bake in a little break in there too. So if you want to get up and manage the time as you'd like to see fit, but we'll start again at 25 after. Okay? Before I move into trying to bring some faith perspective to what we've already discussed, let me just ask, is there any stories or things you want to share that you talked about at your table that you think everyone might enjoy or benefit from hearing? No? Okay. Anything to clarify? Yes?
Well, we found, which I mentioned, this is true for almost every table, we had a lot of things in common. Loss of parents, loss of jobs, children, adult children who've gotten divorced or don't talk to each other, or that kind of crisis. Family dynamics have changed, and
and this might be pretty self-evident, but what happens when we recognize that we're not the only one who's been through a transition like this, or we're not the only one who's kind of walked this way? There is consolation,
yes,
right, in the companionship. Right? Other comments, or yes?
When you posted that spiral and said, we start at the bottom and then we go up, I think that's a very optimistic way to look at it. But unfortunately, I think the reverse many times for people happens. When you are born, you have just endless opportunities and adventures ahead of you. And then somehow you get shaped by your environment, your traditions, your parents, and your world can get narrower with, well, we don't want any ethnic people in our neighborhood. They're Protestants, we're Catholic. And then you see those people lose this wonderful thing that they were started with. And if they go through tragedy, you have 2 choices. You can either get up and say, okay, I'm going to make it one more day, or you can say, oh my God, another day, and you go down the other way. So you have that choice of which way you're going to go. You're going to get the bumps no matter what you do. matter what you do with them.
I think that's a very true observation. And if you look in our society, I think we probably would all agree that there's a lot of elderly people, but we don't have a lot of elders, right? We don't have a lot of wisdom figures who are in their 80s and beyond that you would kind of imagine going to, and just sitting in their presence would be very life-giving for you, because they kind of walk through it all in a way that was very faith-filled, and were able to kind of navigate the bumps and not narrow their own life because of it.
But I think they're all in Congress.
And they're all in Congress. Yeah. We need a couple more in Congress.
Yeah.
Concerning the cyclone tornado, when I first looked at it, for a second I thought that the bottom was the end. I went, no. I changed my view almost immediately. Like, oh no, because as we live, our lives become more encompassing. So that was, I guess that's a healthy way to do it.
That's the ideal.
I thought it had something to do with the Wizard of Oz.
It does have a nice parallel with the well, shall we talk a little bit about how our faith, again, helps us, or brings additional meaning and richness, and it really helps us navigate our move through transitions, hopefully keeping our spiral continuing to expand so that we grow in grace and truth and love. I mentioned the Paschal Mystery, and that is the time, really from the Last Supper, Holy Thursday, when Jesus calls his friends together and celebrates that one last meal with them, through his crucifixion, into the tomb, through the resurrection, and the ascension, all the way to Pentecost. That is, for us Catholics, us Christians, that is the Paschal Mystery. And I want to borrow from a good friend of mine, Terry Nelson Johnson. I don't know if you've ever heard him speak, but he loves to really, he has a great image that helps us recognize that religion is not a spectator sport. It's really not a spectator sport. And it's not Jesus or just Jesus that moves through the Paschal Mystery, but you and I share that same journey. And here's the story, here's the image. Imagine that it's a beautiful October day, much unlike the day we had today. Weather is sunny, crisp, and you are about to go be a spectator at a marathon, which is becoming more and more popular these days. So you get your Gatorades together and your power bars and your oranges and your friends, and you head out to this marathon, which is called the Paschal Mystery Marathon. It not only has an odd name, but it's odd in the sense that there's only one runner, and his name is Jesus. So you're there on the 13-mile marker of the Paschal Mystery Marathon, and you're waiting, you got your pom-poms out, you're waiting to cheer, you create your own cheer for Jesus when he comes by, and here he comes finally. And you're getting so excited, you're waving your pom-poms, Jesus, Jesus, he's our man, if he can't do it, no one can. But what you notice is Jesus starts to slow down, which is a little disconcerting. And then he begins to walk, and what's even more disconcerting is he walks right up to you, and there you are face to face with Jesus. And so sheepishly you say, would you like a Gatorade? Maybe a power bar, right? And Jesus says, no. Well, Jesus, what can I do for you? And with that, he takes your pom-pom and says, you finish the race. You get on this side of the line. I'm going to cheer you on. And that is the Paschal Mystery for us and for Jesus. It's not all about him running the race, right? It's about us taking that same journey, taking that same run, going through that same transformational process. And him taking the pom-pom isn't supposed to be cute, but it's the reminder that we never run it alone. Right? That he is always our companion in it and through it. That's the Paschal Mystery Marathon. So let's look at that series of slides that I gave you earlier, but we'll use some traditional religious language, and maybe it'll open up in a new way. You know, one of the words that we're all familiar with hanging around churches and being invested in our religion is the word mystery, right? When we were kids, we were just taught, oh, just believe it, it's a mystery. You can't really understand it. But really, what mystery is something that has an infinite layer of meaning. Right? So you keep peeling it back, peeling it back, peeling it back, and you always find something more there for you. And that's what this Paschal mystery is for us. That's what these religious truths are for us. This mystery that we continue to find new and richer meaning in the more we peel it back. So hopefully tonight, as we look through this after the lens of looking at that transition framework we did, you'll have some new insights into some old concepts or old religious truths, if you will. So again, here we are in ordinary time. Everything is going just fine. But then instead of an ending, we come to Good Friday. Right? And it's a Paschal death, Good Friday. Again, it could be a divorce. It could be a health crisis. It could be any number of the changes that we've already talked about. But Paschal deaths always lead to new life. But notice how we move through the new life, or to the new life, through Holy Saturday, which is another way to think about liminal space. And it's probably the part of the Paschal Mystery experience that our church needs to focus a little bit more on, because you and I spend a whole lot of time in Holy Saturday. And we tend to think, because Good Friday happens and we jump right to Easter Sunday, that this should happen pretty quickly. I should be to the resurrection by now. But no, we're in Holy Saturday for a lot longer than we often want to be. But the one thing the church does that is quite profound is, if you've ever been in the sanctuary on Holy Saturday, you know that all the images of God are either taken out of the sanctuary or they're covered up. Think about when we were talking about liminal space, and we talked about the disillusionment and the vulnerability and feeling disconnected. The imagery of the church is to say that God is dead, right? That God has disappeared from the scene, right? When we are in Holy Saturday, it's a darkness that comes over us, and we feel that the God that we used to know, that God is no longer with us, right? We don't know that God anymore. When it gets deep into that liminal space, because we're in such darkness in the tomb. But here is the miracle. The miracle is the darkness of the tomb eventually transforms into the darkness of a womb. Because as we said before, anything organic requires darkness to grow. You and I spent our first 9 months in our mother's womb. Nothing but darkness. And we often go back to those times of darkness to be able to move through the Holy Saturday experiences that lead us into Easter Sunday, that invite us into Ascension and Pentecost. Let's look at that other image or diagram, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Easter experience and Ascension and Pentecost. Here, what's interesting, you remember that the vertical axis is you, and the horizontal axis is time. And Easter is written right across the horizontal axis, which is to suggest that it's a moment in time. Right? Think about what you remember from the Easter stories in the Gospel. Right? The women come to the tomb, and what happens? They see a light, and they're filled with fear. And they run back and tell everyone. Easter, God bless you. Easter, it happens in a moment. It happens in a flash. Best way I can describe this from my own experience, sometimes this is hard to talk about, is my son, our youngest son, Michael, was diagnosed with a brain tumor when he was 10. And he died when he was a freshman in high school at age 15. And he was sick for that 4.5 years. But there got to a point in time where we knew that the cancer was not going to be cured and it was going to take his life. And hopefully you've never experienced the loss of a child, but parents may have imagined it. I certainly imagined it before Michael got sick, and as we were confronting this reality that Michael was going to die, he was an awesome kid, I was filled with all kinds of fear. I was filled with thoughts of, I'm never going to get through this. How could we ever survive this as a family? It's just impossible. It's going to be devastating. And then, one day, it wasn't even in a period of prayer, it came to me that, yeah, we are going to get through it. There was like a little vision, a little light to say, I think we're going to get through this. And at that moment, when I had that hopeful feeling, I also was filled with fear. Because I thought that in even feeling that we were going to get through it, I was somehow turning my back on my son. To say that I could possibly live without him. And that's the experience of Easter, right? And it's an experience that invites us into this hopeful light. Right? But we recognize at the same time there's something dreadful or frightening about it because I'm moving into an experience that is so different than what I thought my life was going to be, how I thought my life should be. So it comes in a flash. Right? It comes in a flash. It's the Easter experience. That's how it happened at the tomb, right? They saw it, and they were like, oh man, this is great. And then they were just overwhelmed with fear, and they were puzzled by the whole thing. And I'm still puzzled by Michael's death, and still trying to reconcile all that. But where does that take us to? It takes us to the ascension. Now remember what happened after Jesus died. These people left their families, they left their lives, they invested themselves in Jesus and following Jesus. And the guy was executed as a sinner. And not only that, the Romans were still in charge. And not only that, this group of people were still a persecuted minority within the Jewish community. Their life was not particularly good. They had a lot of investment in this guy Jesus and how they thought it was going to be, how they thought it was going to look like, how it should look like if he's really the Messiah. Right? So they have this Easter experience, but they still got to reconcile the reality of their life, which is so different than they thought it would ever be. And that's when they go back in hiding, right? and they're in the upper room, right? And it takes a while for the real ascension to happen, because what is the ascension but a letting go? A letting go of what was. And look how they picture that in the Gospels. Right? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you've got Jesus sort of ascending into heaven, bodily form, right? And it really makes for some weird art, because you get like that jetpack Jesus, and he's like flying off into the sky. And, but it's a great image to think that these disciples had to let go of the earthly Jesus that they once invested themselves in. Right? That bodily Jesus no longer was there, even though they wanted him so desperately, probably, to be the way it used to be. So we have to move through ascension in order to get to Pentecost, which is receiving the Spirit of life as it is today. Right? Not life as we want it to be, but life as it is right now. And this is the struggle in my own family after losing Michael. Right? To be able to let go of what was, all our hopes and aspirations of what we thought our family was going to be like. We're all doing that in different ways and at different speeds, if you will. But until we do that, we'll never be able to encounter the Spirit, the life that is right today, as it exists now in our family. Right? And it's there. God is present there just as much as God was present when Michael was here with us. But we have to move through the ascension in order to get to the Pentecost, which is receiving that Spirit of what is right now. I think the Gospel of John does the best job of talking about the ascension, at least for me. If you remember the story in John, it's Mary Magdalene who goes to the tomb, and she's wandering around the garden, and she sees the gardener, right? She doesn't really recognize who the gardener is. And finally, it comes to her, it's Jesus, and she says, Rabboni, and she's about to put her arms around Jesus, but what does Jesus say? Mary, don't cling to me.
Don't what?
Don't cling to me. Don't cling to me. Because when I'm clinging, the ascension is not possible. I cannot receive the new Spirit that God wants so desperately to give me. Because that's what God is all about. Every moment is a new moment for God. Every moment is new life. Right? Just every breath we take, right? It's more God's breath than our breath. Every heartbeat we have belongs more to God than it does to us. When we get close to the end of life, we recognize that in spades. Right? When you're sitting at the deathbed of a loved one, you see how breath belongs so much more to God than it does to us. So God is present always. But the only way we're able to receive the Spirit of God that is here right now, in reality as it is if I can let go, if I can stop clinging. Right? If by the grace of God the ascension can once again happen, so that I can experience Pentecost. So that's another way to kind of look at what we talked about from the psychological level. But think about it in terms of our own faith journey. Here's I'm not going to invite you to go back into table discussion, but I just want to ask you one question. I want to ask you this question. I want you to think about your life as it is right now, and ask yourself, where in the Paschal Mystery would you place yourself? Right? Would you place yourself in a Good Friday? Have you recently experienced some kind of Paschal death that is still so fresh? Are you in Holy Saturday where you feel like you're in the tomb? That life is kind of falling apart for you? There's a lot of darkness. You're not sure how to put it back together? Have you had an Easter moment like recently where you caught a glimpse of something hopeful, but it was still so unclear to you? It was more a glimpse, more of a feeling. Are you in Ascension where you're trying to let go? Where you're trying not to cling, where you're praying for the grace, God, let me soften my grip a little bit? Or are you in Pentecost, where you're beginning to receive a new Spirit of the life that you're living right now? And you're recognizing that God is just as present in my reality as it exists now as God was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. In other words, you're allowing whatever happened in your Good Friday experience to bless you as you live today. All right? So just think about your own life. And where would you place it? Where would you place it in the Paschal Mystery? And I'm going to invite some brave volunteers to maybe say where they are thinking their own life is right now. Or,
Can you be in two quadrants?
of course,
For two different
of course,
losses?
yeah. You're feeling like you're in a couple of different.
Because of two different losses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again,
Ascension and Pentecost.
Absolutely. As we talked about way back when, when we were just introducing transitions and talking a little bit, but sometimes we're in multiple transitions, right? So I think you're spot on. Yes.
Well, we were talking here about, even if it's the same transition, and you can spend most of your time being in one of the stages, say Pentecost, for example, and then something will come up, a memory or something, and suddenly you'll be right back momentarily, and then you have to work through it.
So you see that letting go sometimes is ongoing, right? And that, and I don't want to get off into a tangent here, but sometimes, particularly if we've experienced something quite traumatic, and it takes a while to heal from trauma, because trauma violates us so, and so that those flashbacks, if you will, when we find ourselves back feeling like we're right back in the Holy Saturday and nothing has changed, it is often very common for those of us who've experienced some degrees of trauma. And sometimes trauma can be as simple as being slighted at work. It just cut so deep in our life for whatever reason, it became a traumatic event for us.
What about guilt? I know I experienced guilt in a couple of my situations. Where does that fall into as far as, it's not denial, obviously. Is it part of resistance or?
Well, do you know the priest Thomas Keating, who is he's a great teacher of centering prayer. He's got a great one-liner on guilt. He said, "Guilt should last no more than 10 minutes." Right? Because again, God is always calling us to reconciliation. Right? God is always calling us to something new. So if we're trapped in our guilt, there becomes resistance. There becomes it's something more than guilt. It often becomes shame. And here's again, just to bring another scripture story into play that maybe will help you think about this a little differently. Think about one of my favorite scripture stories is the creation myth, because there's so much there. But you know what happens. God creates this beautiful garden and takes Adam and Eve and puts them in the middle of the garden and says, all of this is for you. Have a great time with it. And I'll come back in the evenings when it's cool and we'll walk together in the garden. Sounds good. But then God says, but there's one tree, and I'm going to put it in the middle of the garden here, and you're going to walk by it every day, but I don't want you to eat any of the fruit off this tree. And I'm going now. See you later. Now, think about that. That's like you take a couple of boys and you sit them down at the kitchen table and you say, oh, here's a couple of Oreo cookies. Just leave them there. Don't eat them. I'll be back later. What's going to happen? Of course the kids are going to eat the cookies. Maybe the sin of that story is not so much that they ate the fruit, but what happened after they ate the fruit? They hid themselves from God. They hid themselves in their shame. They were no longer able to be face to face with God, naked as they were. They had to cover themselves up with fig leaves. And shame became an obstacle between them and God. Is that the sin? And when I say sin, what I mean is the blockage for us to be able to receive the love of God, participate in that love, and return it back to the world somehow. So again, it's hard to, we have to talk about these things in generalities so I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what came to me. Got a couple more minutes if there's anything else. Anybody in any parts of the Paschal Mystery? Any questions for clarification? Stories? Anything that struck you?
Beings and not human doings. And we need to sit with just being who we are and be still to receive whatever the bounty is that surrounds us. And if we're always doing, we create that cycle around us that nothing can get through. We just need to be. But, you know, with that Puritan society, like you said, get going, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, what's the matter with you, blah, blah, blah. You can have that ability to say, you know what? Go pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I'm done. Oh, wait a minute.
The Pope's new letter, I haven't read it cover to cover certainly, but one of my favorite quotes is, he says, being has primacy over useful being. You know, the popes have to speak in these kind of very lofty languages, but it's exactly what you're saying. Being has primacy over useful being. We're so taken by thinking that we always have to be useful, right? That whatever we do has to have some kind of purpose or function. But the Pope says no. Being has primacy, not useful. Anything more, friends? Enough? All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.